Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for being here. Happy belated Thanksgiving from me and the board of Agenda Alexandria. My name is Rod Cookrow, and I'm chairman of Agenda Alexandria this year. I want to welcome all the people here in this room and all those people who are watching us online. Before we begin, I want to ask you to do what I just did, which is if you have a phone, just mute it. You can still get your messages and stuff, but just make sure we don't have to listen to those. That would be very helpful and considerate to our panel. I'm going to turn the panel over in a few minutes to Michael Pope, who many of you know as a prominent local journalist. He's also a member of our board and is a former chairman of Agenda Alexandria. But before I begin, I want to recognize the people who really make this organization work. In particular, our board members. If you're on the board, just stand up or raise your hand so people can see who you are. Jenny, Darylyn, Linda, Ricardo, Micah. We are all volunteers, and we do this for the love of the issues that we talk about. We also rely on contributions of people like you to help this organization run. I want to recognize our largest funders because they deserve that. And they include Simpson Development, McInerney Associates, the Zebra newspaper, and some individual sponsors, Marion Moon, Val Hawkins, Linda and Steve App, who I think are here tonight, Chris Lewis, who's a former board member, and Ricardo Alfaro, a current board member. And this month we also have 3 new sustaining members who have contributed $250 a year to be members. Eileen Ahern, the West End Business Association, and I see the name of Frank Fannin here, Frank Fannin, who is a former chairman of this organization as well. Tonight's topic, of course, is very interesting. We just had an election in November, and we're going to be talking about elections in Alexandria in the past, in the present, but more importantly in the future. We've invited the members of the city's electoral board to be here tonight. It's a 3-member board appointed by the local courts. This year, I think it's 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. We have 1 member here, Tom Fulton. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it. I also want to recognize in our audience former Vice Mayor Bill Cleveland. It's important that Bill's here because one of the things Bill accomplished when he was on the council is that he led an initiative, a bipartisan initiative with the former Democrat Councilman Lonnie Rich, to move to elected school boards. The reason we have elected school boards is because of Bill Cleveland. And right now the school board itself is having discussions about whether they should not go back to appointed, but whether they should do staggered terms or have more members or fewer members. And so that's an ongoing discussion, and that's a discussion that this gentleman started 35 years ago, so thank you, Bill. The last thing I want to mention is that we do not have a program in December because it's the holidays, but we will resume in January on the 22nd when we're going to have a program that's going to focus on the city's efforts to increase access to IT technologies, whether it's through email, distance learning, more competition on cable and internet, but also what the city can do to use artificial intelligence to allow citizens and government to interact more effectively. We're still framing up the actual way that panel is going to look, and we'll be announcing that probably in mid-December, so look for that in your email. Anyway, I'll now stop talking and turn it over to Michael, who will introduce our panel and take care of the rest of tonight's activities. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right. Excuse me. All right. This is going to be fun. I appreciate seeing all the familiar faces in the audience. Thanks for coming. Thanks for you to streaming at home. Going to jump right into introducing our panel on elections, the past, present, and future of democracy in Alexandria. So I want to start on stage right, your left, which is Michael Maybach. He is managing director at the James Wilson Institute, also a fellow at Save Our States, which is a nonprofit that defends the Electoral College. More than 25 years in Alexandria. In the center, we've got Darylyn Franklin, who is president of the NAACP here in Alexandria. Also, she used to be a precinct captain at the Beatley precinct, and she was campaign manager for Del Pepper, not once, not twice, but 3 times. So lots of experience there. And then to my right here is Scott Vierick, who is a board member of the Alexandria Historical Society and a historian, with the consulting group History Associates. So we got a great panel on elections. I want to sort of set the scene here by lightening the mood just a little bit to talk about a fun thing that used to happen with elections that no longer happens anymore, which is candidates used to liquor up voters. They used to literally give alcohol to voters to get their votes. So I'm going to have Scott Viereck explain how could that possibly happen?
Absolutely. So thank you, Michael.
Right up on the microphone, please.
Whoops. Sorry, first time. All right, so thank you, Michael. The best way to illustrate how this worked in 18th century elections is to talk about a man who was a rising politician at the time. He was a planter. You might have heard of him. His name was George Washington. So in 1755, George Washington's friends put his name up for election in Frederick County, Virginia. At the time, his main plantation, of course, Mount Vernon, is in Fairfax County, but Washington is friends with the House of Burgess delegates in Fairfax. He doesn't want to upset them. He's got land out in Frederick County, which included Winchester, Virginia, and so that made him, under the rules at the time, eligible to run there. Washington loses the election. In the election of 1755, Hugh West got 271 votes. Thomas Swearington got 270. George Washington got 40. Now, Washington's friends try to console him. They say, hey, you were a late entrant into the race. People don't really know you. It's okay. You'll win next time. And Washington's like, I better win next time. So in the next election, Washington is going to pay 39.6 pounds to his friends to buy 45 gallons of beer, 40 gallons, 1 hogshead, 1 barrel, and 10 bowls of rum punch, 35 gallons of wine, 2 gallons of cider, and 3.5 pints of brandy. So that's all given out to the voters. And Washington writes his friends, who are the one actually buying the alcohol for him, my only fear is that you spent with too sparing a hand. So he's like, oh my gosh, you should have bought more. So alcohol at elections was a huge thing in 18th century voting. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is later on. But it was a huge part of elections. Now, under Virginia law at the time, it was illegal for Washington to serve the alcohol himself. That was seen as influencing the vote. However, there was nothing in the books against Washington reimbursing his friends for buying the alcohol, and then having friends, family, indentured servants, enslaved workers actually pass it out to the voters on election day. So what Washington is doing, it isn't, again, everybody else is doing it at the time. He's not, you might say he's violating the spirit of the law, if not the letter, but all the other candidates are doing it too. And ultimately, in that next election, Washington wins. So his friends bought enough alcohol.
Now, he blamed his loss in that first election on his failure to bring enough liquor to the polls, correct?
He didn't say it specifically in his writings, but given how much he was focused on buying enough alcohol the next time, yeah.
And you said beer, wine, brandy, rum, and cider. This is for one election.
Yep.
Okay.
For one election. And alcohol actually remains a part of Alexandria elections for years to come. We have an article in the Alexandria Gazette from 1885 that reads, "The whiskey flowed freely, but there were no disturbances of the peace." So there you go, everyone.
All right. So just a little fun to start our festivities. By the way, we have wine over in the corner. But another interesting fact about Alexandria's history is the ward system, which obviously people have lots of opinions today about whether or not Alexandria should have wards or precincts or areas like the school board currently has District A, District B, and District C. So Alexandria has a really interesting history with having wards and then not having wards, and then and so there was an interesting back and forth. And so I want to get the panelists' views on the ward system. But Scott, I'm going to start with you again. So explain this interesting scenario where there was a ward system that was created when the District of Columbia was created in the early 1800s. And then they got rid of the ward system, and then they brought a ward system back, and then they got rid of that ward system. Explain all this.
Yeah, so it's a real interesting process of back and forth. So initially, local government in Alexandria is handled by the trustees, who are appointed by the House of Burgesses. And then when a member leaves or dies, the trustees got to pick the next one. So there was no voting whatsoever for the trustees. 1779, Alexandria becomes a town. And from there, that opened up elections to members of the city council who, amongst their number, after they were elected, chose aldermen, a recorder, and a mayor. Now, in the early 19th century, as we all know, Alexandria became a part of the District of Columbia, and it was given a new city charter in 1805. And with that charter came a system of wards. The city was divided into 4 wards, and each ward got to elect a certain number of council members and aldermen. Now, come the Civil War, the city is under Union occupation. Immediately after the war, the restored government of Virginia, which was set up in opposition to the Confederate Virginia legislature, they tried to adopt a new charter for the city that would have returned to an at-large system. That struck down shortly afterwards, and so up until 1919 and the early 1920s, you had this ward system. Now, in the late 19 teens, there was talk about moving away from a council-mayor system of government to a city manager system of government. It first goes up to a vote in 1919, and that effort fails by 8 votes. Comes up for a vote again in 1921, and it overwhelmingly passes. So with that, the council and the mayor get shrunk drastically. All elections become at large, and you have a 5-person council, and they elect the mayor from amongst their ranks. Now, in the early 1930s, you have the annexation of the town of Potomac. And those of you who've read a little bit about that history know that many citizens in the town of Potomac did not want to join Alexandria. They were furious about joining Alexandria. There's the old story, which I've never been able to find firm documentation about it, but wouldn't it be incredible if it were true that right before the town of Potomac formally joined Alexandria, they took all the town records and set them all on fire, which, again, as of now, just folklore. We haven't been able to determine one way or the other.
Can I jump in
Sure.
here quickly?
Have you
So,
proved it, Michael?
you said it may be folklore, it may be apocryphal. We don't have any evidence that it happened. However, we don't have those records. So the absence of the record is itself kind of evidence, don't you think?
There you go. There you go.
I didn't mean to interrupt your story.
No, absolutely. So the citizens of the town of the Potomac start to really push for a ward system. They argue that all the current members of the council live in Alexandria, not in what was once the town of Potomac, so they're not being represented. They argue that the services they're getting from the city are inadequate, that they need more support from the city, they need more resources, and they see a ward system as being a way to get that. There's also the fact that the town of Potomac in the 1920s took great pride in the fact that they did not let any black Alexandrians or black Arlingtonians live in the town. So it's also very possible that a racial angle was also driving their push for a ward system in the early 1930s. So eventually, they're able to get enough support to put this to a vote, and in each of the wards of the city, it overwhelmingly passes. For the most part, though, it's like 2-1, but in the former town of Potomac, it passed somewhere, I want to say, around 5-1. So they really wanted that ward system. Now, that goes around for a little bit. They start to run into challenges with the ward systems. There's concern about how the city council is working. I should say that this also bumped up the number of council members. So under this new ward system, you had 6 wards, so more than the 4 you had previously because you now have a larger geographic area. You have 1 person elected from each wards, and then you have 3 council members elected at large. And of those 3 council members elected at large, the one who gets the most votes becomes the mayor. So there is controversy, there's challenges relating to setting up the new system. It starts to get unpopular. It was quite a fight to get the ward system in the first place. The council opposed it, the Chamber of Commerce opposed it, a number of civic organizations opposed it, and because of that, that opposition never quite went away. It continued to remain a contentious issue. So in the 1940s, it's put up again to a vote in 1944, and the effort to go back to an at-large system fails. And then later on, it's put up to a vote again, and this time the effort to go back to an at-large system succeeds. And that's what we've had ever since. However, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s, there's been there continued to be talk about the ward system, and I can talk a little bit more about that later on. But obviously, you know, the discussion we're having about wards today, we're not the first ones to have that discussion. It's something that the city has been debating for over a century at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much for walking us through all of that history. It is really interesting that Alexandria had a ward system, and then it got rid of the ward system, and then the people in Del Rey demanded representation. They also had restrictive covenants that only allowed white people to own property. So there's a racial undertone here. And so this ping pong of having wards and not having awards, as Scott just said, we are not the first people to have this conversation. But I definitely wanted to have this conversation tonight about the future of wards in Alexandria. So potentially bringing a ward system back for a third time, which is why I want to bring in Michael Maybach to our discussion, because this is an issue that you have advocated for many years, correct?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Michael. Happy to be here, and thank you all for turning out this evening because you care about our fair city. If we had city council wards, I think it's fair to say that we would have less densification than is going on now and more parks, maybe more roads and more schools to accommodate the densification. We probably would have had Seminary Road narrowed rather than widened, and King Street as well. Fewer potholes, because if you had one in front of your house, you would know who to call, right? Our city council and our mayor live in 4 of our 8 zip codes. So if you don't live in their zip codes, they don't know about your problems. And maybe scooters would be docked the way the bicycles are, rather than end up in front of your home. And finally, tomorrow night, we probably wouldn't have a major zoning revolution in this city. We already have 13% of our homes are single family. It's 45% in Fairfax County and 63% the rest of the country. But apparently 13% single family homes are just too much for the city council, and we have a big debate going on. Now, as some people know, the U.S. Congress outlawed at-large elections in 1848, 3 years after the telegraph was invented. And Los Angeles outlawed at-large elections in 1925, much longer time because they weren't a city in the United States for a long time. But the cities of Richmond, Newport News, Virginia Beach, and Norfolk, all about our size, although Virginia Beach is bigger, all have city council wards, as does Washington, D.C. And we are one of very few places in this state that have at-large elections. Arlington County, it's Falls Church, Charlottesville, and Alexandria.
Darylyn Franklin at the NAACP, and with your history with the Alexandria Democratic Committee, what are your thoughts on creating a new ward system in Alexandria? I mean, currently the school boards have districts, wards essentially. Should Alexandria City Council members have as actual districts that they represent?
Thank you for having me here tonight. And I welcome each and every one of you here to listen to voting us on these very important issues. In my opinion, I think we should keep the status quo the way that it is. The ward system has significant impact on local politics, influencing the way candidates campaign and interact with voters. Ward councilors are typically more accessible to constituents than larger citywide officials and their campaigns, with focus on issues that are specific to their ward. However, the ward system can have contribute to a fragmentation of local politics with councilors representing different wards having different priorities and interests. This can lead to competition and conflict between councilors and a lack of cohesion in municipal decision-making. The ward system has faced criticism over the years, with some arguing that it can contribute to corruption and cronyism in local politics. Ward councilors may be more susceptible to the influence of local interest groups and campaign donors, leading to conflicts of interest and favoritism in decision-making. That is my opinion.
You said corruption and cronyism. I'm curious about that. Like, how would a ward system lead to corruption and cronyism?
For example, if we have a ward system, say if it's in District A, which is now Old Town, which is where we're sitting, and if there is influence with developers in any way, or there may be influence like what's happened in a local politician in New York, where you have some contributing to his campaign to get him to persuade one way or another on a particular issue.
Michael Maybach, I'm going to get you just 1 second. Scott, on the issue of corruption and cronyism, I'm curious about the demise of the previous ward system in the 1940s. I got the sense it might not have been corruption and cronyism, but certainly mismanagement. And there was sort of overlapping. The ward representatives felt like they could spend money, and so did the city manager, and so too much money was spent, and so therefore people's taxes went up and people got mad, which is why they got rid of the ward system. That's not the same thing as corruption and cronyism. It's mismanagement. Was there any allegations of corruption and cronyism?
Correct, absolutely. From the documents I reviewed, it was less corruption and more, as you said, that mismanagement issue of this isn't working for us. Around the time there was talk about, again, the taxes, as you noted, and how they'd gone up, and people were frustrated about that. Ultimately, though, it was a pretty contentious issue then, as it is now. So one of the challenges as a historian is taking a look at the sources and pulling back that partisan bias. What I did find fascinating was listening to the arguments here and thinking back on some of the sources I read preparing for this talk. Just hearing some of what they were arguing back then for and against the wards. So in one article, supporters of the wards said that, opponents of the wards called them conducive to petty politics. And another opponent of the wards said, you're drawing an imaginary line around a few city blocks and preventing these residents from voting for councilmen from other parts of the city. Now those in favor of the wards said, look, when you have a ward, and I quote, a representative is no further away than a few blocks from the people of his ward. So it's interesting seeing how some of these debates have continued to evolve.
Yeah.
And I was just
saying those arguments you just read from the contemporaneous newspapers map out exactly the conversation we're having tonight. Michael Maybach, I know that you had some response maybe to what Darrell and Franklin just said.
Yeah, thanks. I've lived for 26 years on Queen Street, and both parties are represented, I guess you would say, that's for sure. My neighbors think that at-large elections are neighborhood suppression. Our votes and our voices are never heard or felt. The NAACP, if you go to their website, has a paper on at-large elections. It's right over there. I printed it out, where they take a stand. Matter of fact, the NAACP, since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, has brought lots of litigation to small and large cities in the South as part of Jim Crow at-large campaigns, elections. So the history there is very difficult for this country. There's another article I printed out where Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote in an opinion, in a dissent, wrote that at-large elections is a second level of discrimination against citizens. Now, the U.S. House of Representatives has districts. Since 1848, they have to. The Virginia House of Delegates and the Virginia Senate have districts. If we didn't, then we'd have a Congress of all one party or the other for the country, 435. We'd have 40 delegates, either Republican or Democrat. We'd have 100 40 state senators and 100 delegates, both of one party or the other. This is no way to run a republic, if you will, and to have our city council and the mayors not living in half of the city means that they don't know what's going on your street if they don't live on your street. Finally, on corruption, my gosh, when you have one party that always wins because at-large elections de facto is a form of tyranny. It's, Lord Acton said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you always have one party whose primary in June elects the mayor and city council, who will donate to that party versus the opposition party? And who will develop a city the way we're more developed? We have more density than most of the large cities in this country, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So the developers have had quite their way without the corruption of city council wards. I think city council wards would be a wonderful reform for Alexandria.
Daryl and Franklin, do you have any reaction to what he just said about the NAACP's thoughts on at-large elections?
I would have to look more into what he is exactly speaking of and in what content that it's in. However, ward systems, in my opinion, creates disparities within a community. If you have ward systems on the West End, they may not be in, thank you, they may not be in constant agreement with what they're doing on the West End and vice versa. Those, again, these are my opinions, not the opinions of the NAACP. Again, I haven't read this, and I would be more than happy to. Thank you very much for handing it to me.
Scott.
That's all.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add, and again, just hearing this conversation here, it's bringing to mind so many of the things I found in my research. And to the point about the role of the NAACP and the ACLU in working with cities, in some cases suing them to adopt ward systems, I came across a very interesting article in the Baltimore African American from 1969 talking about the ward system and the change to at-large in Richmond, Virginia, where they wrote, when it became impossible to gerrymander the city, a switch was made to an at-large method of electing city council. So for that reason, in the 1980s, you saw the Virginia NAACP issue a list of all these localities they were going to target for moving away from an at-large to a ward system. Now here's where the story gets interesting, though. When they issued the list, Alexandria was on the list, and the Alexandria NAACP, the response from Ulysses Calhoun, who was president at the time, was a very kind of lukewarm, it might work here. And in fact, he's quoted as saying, I don't know why Alexandria was picked. The black population is so scattered because housing opportunities are pretty open. And Lionel Hope, who at the time was the only black member of the Alexandria City Council, agreed. And he's quoted as saying, my feeling is that in a city like Alexandria, a ward system wouldn't be practical. There are some neighborhoods that are solidly black, but not to the proportion that it would make me feel that we would need to go to the ward system. Now, the director of the Northern Virginia Urban League, he supported the wards. Melvin Miller, who was a longtime activist in the city, he was quoted as saying, changing the ward system could enhance our chances, but the change wouldn't guarantee it. So in the 1980s, you had the state NAACP really pushing hard for moving towards a ward system, but you had some resistance from the local NAACP chapter, and you had the debate of, well, what's going to be the best thing to move the city forward? What's going to be the best thing to create a more equal city? So again, just hearing these arguments, it's just fascinating to hear how they're similar and how they're different to some of these debates about wards that happened in the past.
Michael, maybe a question from the audience. What do we know, what percentage of Virginia cities and what percentage of the U.S. have at-large elections? So like, how do other places in Virginia handle this? How do other cities across the country handle this?
Well, I did list cities, so Richmond, Newport News, Virginia Beach, Norfolk. I tried to find cities that were about our size. We're about 160-some thousand. And these are the other cities that are about our size in the state. And they all have ward systems. Now, Virginia Beach did not have a ward system. They had a hybrid of wards and at-large. And in 2020, a woman named Holloway brought a suit under the Civil Rights Act of 1963 in federal court. She's a black woman. She said, you know, most of the time the at-large seats are all white people. She won the suit. The federal judge remanded the city to go to wards, and now Virginia Beach has 10 wards. And perhaps someone will bring litigation here in Alexandria under the Civil Rights Act of 1965.
Question from the audience about the 1950 vote to get rid of the ward system. Do we know what the motivation was for that? I mean, we've talked about the history of at-large elections having a racial undertone. Do we know what the reasoning was in 1950 that the city got rid of the ward system? Was there at least a public racial discussion, or was it more about money and finances?
Yeah, so, and you're referring to the 1948 election,
48,
correct?
excuse me, 48, yeah.
Yeah, so again, looking at the sources I reviewed, I didn't see an explicit racial angle, which was interesting just given the time period that we were in, where there were so many of these fights relating to civil rights, relating to equality, and relating to white supremacists trying to fight that every step of the way. Most of the debates I saw about that were what I quoted to you all earlier, where it was more kind of on the technical merits of it. So I didn't see anybody kind of appealing to either overt arguments relating to the issue of race in the city or any subtle arguments relating to that. Doesn't mean it's not there, but I didn't see that as part of my review.
All right. There are lots of topics I want to get to today: ranked choice voting, early voting, staggered terms, May to November, 2-year terms versus 3-year terms, school board, politics. But I wanted to make sure we got everything that we wanted to say about wards, because clearly this is a topic that the audience is interested in and our panel is interested in. Michael Maybach, any other things people should know about this discussion about whether or not Alexandria should have a ward system?
Well, thank you. I recommend that we move to 2-year elections for city council for several reasons. One, in the odd number year, it will align with the state legislature, and we're a body within the Commonwealth, so we should align with them. Number two, it's never in a U.S. presidential or U.S. Senate race, and we want to divorce that. We want to stay state and local here. Number three, instead of having to campaign, if you run for city council for 160,000 people, you campaign for 25,000, which is quite doable for people. They can go door to door. They can be known by their neighbors. As soon as it's 160,000, you have to raise $100,000, and it's a full-time job, but you have your day job, etc. And a 2-year term, more people will commit to 2 years than to 3, of course, and we'll have more choice on the ballot. So I think 2 years. Moving to 2 years on the odd number year would be a huge improvement. Next year we'll have our city council elections in the middle of a presidential campaign, as we did, as Frank Fannin knows, in 2012 when Obama was elected president. And Frank had been elected to the city council in 2009 when we had May elections. We had from 1804 to 2009, either February, June, or May elections with city council, so only people that cared about those elections would vote. But when Mr. Wilson, the current mayor, was defeated by Frank and Alicia Hughes and Tim Levine, they were on the city council, they were not reelected. 2 days later, they introduced before the council, let's move the elections to November, and that's what happened. Then you had the landslide for Obama here, and 2 people that had been elected 3 years earlier were thrown off, probably because they were lost in that. So that's the history of this. We should have never gone from May to November, but now you can't, by state law, return to May elections.
All right. I actually had May to November as a separate bullet point, but I'm glad you hit it now. Darylyn Franklin, any other? Go ahead.
I just have one question for Michael. Why not have, because you said we should not have city council and mayoral elections during presidential years. You really didn't give a reason why.
Oh, well, in 1804, when they decided to have February elections, they particularly chose it so that it wouldn't be in November, so that the federal elections and the state it gives citizens a time to look at what's going on in our city and our state versus what's going on nationally. And so that's what happened. Now, Bill Ewell was mayor in, if I can find it, was 2007, and he appointed a commission on electoral reform, 9 members, 5 Democrats, 4 Republicans. And here, I have the numbers here, 2007. 9 out of 9 voted against moving city elections to November, if ever in a presidential year. 7 voted to keep elections in May. These are Democrats and Republicans. And none voted to do something else with this system. So Mayor Ewell had heard these arguments about moving to November, and he appointed a bipartisan commission. And the turnout is probably half in the city elections historically what it is in the national. And the reason is because every 5 years, 50% of the people that live in this city leave. We have hyper turnover, like most communities don't have in this country, because we have young people coming here, federal government, lots of universities, etc. You rent an apartment, you vote once or twice, you vote straight party ticket, and you think, well, there's a city council. I don't know the Democrat from the Republican. I'll just vote straight party. Don't know much about this town, and 2 years from now, I'm moving to Arlington anyway. And so that's why people wouldn't vote in May if they really didn't know about or care about the place they're renting an apartment from. But now it's in November. People are all together in the election, and it's very harmful for us to be able to look at what's going on in our own city. So hyper is the national campaign.
And
Scott.
I don't agree with that at all. I think the reason that you have votes, that you have elections in November, is to make sure that with presidential years that you get a majority of people that vote. I do agree with what you stated, that there are people that do not vote in non-presidential years. They vote every 4 years, and they're voting for president, vice president, sometimes Senate, sometimes not, sometimes city council, sometimes not. I believe that the way that the system is now, where we're voting every 3 years, or we have a primary in June, right? And then we have a general election in October, I believe that should stand the way that it is.
Scott Vera.
November.
Yeah. Yeah, so I just want to jump in on that real quickly. And the kind of the discrepancy between turnout in national elections versus turnout in local elections, that's been something that has been concerning to local politicians, civic activists. It's been something for a long time. You know, I was seeing that in 1992. They were talking about how you had 76% of voters voting for president. You had 30% voting for city council. I will say, and this is less about history, but I am gonna dispute that characterization of young people. Hi, I moved into the city about 8 years ago. I rented then, I continue to rent now. And I voted in my first election that first year. You better believe I did the research. I looked up who was running, I looked up their positions, and I resent that idea that I would just vote by a party line, that I wouldn't care about the city where I'm living. That's just not my experience. That's not the experience of many of the young people I know who are who move into Alexandria, who frankly love living here, but in many cases it's too expensive for us to continue living here. So I would say let's look at other options for why people aren't voting in local elections versus national elections. So I just want to make that point.
But before you do, I, like Michael, I moved here 12 years ago. I also rent. I also voted in my first election in 2012. Not only did I vote in my first election in 2012, I have voted in every primary and in every general election since I moved to this city.
Well, that's excellent. What I was talking about is 50% of the people that come here leave within 5 years. That's all. It's just a fact. I didn't say their age. I'm just saying people get out of college, they change jobs, they move here from Alabama, whatever it is. But we have a high voter turnover. The other thing is, I believe we're the only municipality in the entire state that has 3-year terms for their city council. What I found was 2 or 4 year in the cities I named, I'll stand corrected if somebody knows. But who else has 3-year elections besides Alexandria? Nobody in the state. To go into a federal election next year, and the next year into the state, and then the next year the state, and then back to the federal, makes no sense in terms of stability of self-government.
All right. We obviously have a great discussion going on, and I want to make sure we hit all of our bullet points, because when I was chatting with people in the audience before we began, the ward system is obviously a bit popular topic. The other topic I heard a lot of people asking me about, and I see it reflected in these questions, is ranked choice voting. So I wanted to make sure we got that, which is that as a voter, you might rank your first choice, your second choice, your third choice. So Arlington recently did this, where they had 2 openings for 2 county board members, and you got to rank your first, second, and third choice. But you only got 1 vote. So 2 open seats, but you had what they call a single transferable vote, which is how they calculated. So there's obviously skepticism about that. However, I will point out for the people in this room that don't like the zoning changes that Alexandria is considering, Arlington recently had very similar zoning changes. And under the old rules, the supporters of the zoning change would have won both of those seats. But Michael Maybach, ranked choice voting allowed opponents of the Arlington zoning change to be represented on the Arlington County Board, and they would have lost in a traditional election. What are your thoughts on ranked choice voting in Alexandria?
So, if we had a vote in this room today on your favorite pet, and we had 3 on the ballot, dog, cat, and squirrel. I know there must be somebody that has a squirrel. You know that there's a lot of dog lovers in Alexandria, but also cat lovers, and there's some mixed marriages that have dogs and cats at home, and we pray for these people. If we just took a vote, there would be either the dogs or the cats would win. But under ranked choice, you're required to vote and rank each one, and you know that what would happen? The people that were for dogs would then rank squirrels and then cats last because they want to win. And the cat lovers would rank squirrels next and then dogs because they want to win. That's ranked choice voting is a way to game the system. And because of that, you'll all end up voting for squirrels as your favorite pet.
Well, I think you're talking about Governor Squirrel, because Glenn Youngkin won in a ranked choice election.
So there were 4 rounds in that, and he won all 4 of them. So did the lieutenant governor and the attorney general. And as a Republican, I participated in that, but I hope we never do it again. It wasn't useful, and Mr. Youngkin won every iteration we had. So it didn't prove anything other than exhaustion of the voter.
Carolyn Franklin, any thoughts on ranked choice voting?
So, along with NAACP, there are some that agree with it. There are some that do not agree with it. Ranked choice voting, I looked up NAACP, did my research on various other organizations, and I came across another organization I'm involved with, which is League of Women Voters, who said ranked choice voting with cities like San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Portland, and Maine, use elected and their mayors, and that has likened to an instant runoff. So with ranked choice voting, you won't know who your candidate, if they won or not, until, like, there's 30 votes for me and 31 votes for someone else, and then the lowest person, they may get 20, they're immediately eliminated. And then it goes to a runoff based on these other 2 candidates, and then that person is then voted from there. I personally think, and I mentioned to someone earlier today, that if I'm a single mom living at home, I had my husband was killed in a war, and I'm taking care of our small kids, and I may have 4 of them, and I'm also taking care of his mother because she lives at home with us, and I'm working full time. Am I going to have time out of my busy schedule to go and look and see who are all the candidates and how should they be ranked? And if I'm voting along county line and I'm not educated on who I really want, then I lose out. I walk into a ballot box and I'm like, okay, I don't know who's who. And I want to cross the box off that I've done my civic duty for today. I'm just going to vote in 1, 2, 3, and then walk out without not knowing who won or who the candidates are or what their issues are that they stand on. I think when you vote the way that voting is now, where you vote along party line, like with a lot of people vote Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party, you know exactly what their issues are, you know exactly who the candidates are, versus ranked choice voting where you walk on a ballot and you may be confused and you walk away. I don't know who I voted for because I didn't vote along party line. So how's that going to benefit me if this is not issues that I'm educated on and if I don't know anything about? So, and the other thing that the League of Women Voters is saying, with a country that's so divided as ours, why are we looking to change so many things if we're so divided right now?
Amen.
Well, before we move on from ranked choice voting, because it's a topic clearly people are interested in, Michael Maybach, question for you. So it is a way for minorities to be represented. So like if you think about Arlington, most voters in Arlington supported the zoning change, their version of zoning for housing. The ranked choice voting allowed opponents to be represented on the county board. You could make a similar case in Alexandria about minority voices in the Republican Party getting representation on the Alexandria City Council, but you don't think that would work here?
I'm in this voting block right here.
Yes, I was trying to make the other case because we've got both of our panelists actually don't like ranked choice voting very much.
Ranked choice voting increases government costs as well as campaign costs. It confuses voters. It harms voter turnout, as it turns out, according to university studies. Elderly people, disabled, those with limited English skills have a very hard time understanding it, and most citizens cannot explain it. It makes people more cynical about our election system at a time when that's not what we need in this country, is more cynicism about the gaming. We used to have elections, now we have, all kinds of things, drop boxes and ballot harvesting and 45 days to vote before people debate, etc. We don't pick our car or our vacation or our job or our home or our spouse by a software algorithm. Nobody joins ranked choice dating. That's not what happens when they want to have a spouse. I don't think, although maybe there'll be an app one of these days. You pick 5 people and they'll tell you who your spouse is. But it's just, they do that now. There you go. So
it's a special app. It's a special app for squirrels. So while we're on the top, we actually have touched on some things I want to ask Scott about the history of. One is, ranked choice voting is essentially a new way of looking at voting. So I want to talk about the secret ballot and also partisan elections. So starting with secret ballot and then moving into partisan elections. So, today we think of our vote as being totally a secret thing. Nobody knows what your vote is. But Scott, that's not the case for all of Alexandria history, right?
Yeah, no. And for any of you who are listening to me talk about George Washington and being like, well, what if somebody takes Washington's whiskey and then walks into the voting booth and then, votes for I think his name was John Swearington or whatever. That was because for much of Alexandria's history, and in fact much of this country's history, elections weren't supposed to be secret. They were supposed to be done out in the open. And in the 18th century and much of the 19th century, elections were conducted through a method called viva voce. And if I mispronounce the Latin there, I apologize.
We can just call it a voice vote.
Voice vote,
yeah.
Exactly. And essentially what that meant was a voter would go to the polling place, and instead of going into the voting booth, they would state their vote to the election judges and anybody who wanted to show up and watch.
And
So-
and there are poll books. If you go to the library today, you can actually get poll books from the 1840s that lists every single voter and how they voted, the specific people they voted for. Right?
Yep. And in fact, among Washington's papers, we have the poll books from his elections. Washington hung on to them. And keep in mind, in the 18th and for much of the 19th century, who could vote was very restricted. So elections in those days were public activities, but the act of being able to vote was very restricted. So 18th century Virginia, only white men over the age of 21 who met certain property requirements could vote.
So also I wanted to touch on, because we talked about partisan voting, even reflexively partisan voting. You were telling me something you dug up that I'd never heard about, which was in the 1940s in Alexandria. There was a referendum on having nonpartisan local elections. So we currently have Democrats and Republicans running for city council, but it doesn't have to be that way. In many locations across Virginia, all of their local elected officials are supposedly nonpartisan. So what was the history there that you found?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 1949, as you said, Michael, there was an advisory referendum on moving to a nonpartisan system of voting for local offices in the city of Alexandria. And it passed overwhelmingly. And then, as far as I can tell, nothing happened.
This is the same era they got rid of the ward system. That's kind of interesting. So Michael Maybach, Darylyn Franklin, any thoughts about Alexandria being a place where you elect Democrats and Republicans, or what would you think about having nonpartisan elections? Supposedly, I guess ostensibly the parties would still make endorsements, as they often do in these kinds of elections, school board elections, for example. But, you know, is it a good idea to have Democrats and Republicans running for city council? Michael Maybach, I'll start with you.
You go first.
Okay. There is a state law that says if you have partisan local elections, the party candidates have to be in boxes, and you'll see that on your ballot. All the Democrats in this box, Republicans, Independents. I think if we're going to have at-large elections, and that's for at-large elections, by the way, that's why they passed that. Harry S. Byrd, I believe, was the governor that signed it. It was part of the Byrd machine, that they called it in those days. I think we ought to have our candidates listed alphabetically. So you actually, rather than vote everybody in a box, just alphabetically, and you have to know something about them and their name. But that would be a state legislative action. I'm all for secret ballots. And is there something else you want me to comment?
Oh, no, that was fine. Darylyn Franklin, any thoughts about Alexandria moving to a nonpartisan version of city council where you don't have Democrats and Republicans running for city council?
I'm thinking if you put them in alphabetical, was it first name or last name? You know, like, do I go D or B, whoever's first?
When you were managing Del Pepper's campaign, how was the order? Wasn't it like randomly selected?
Randomly selected by who showed up at the office. So,
but if they all showed up at the same time, didn't they draw lots?
They would draw. I'm not sure exactly what they would do exactly, but I do know that it was always a proponent that she wanted to get somewhere in the middle. She didn't want to be last. She didn't care about being first, as long as she got somewhere in the middle. So
why is that?
The reason is because if there's 6 candidates, and if you don't know who the candidates are, going back to my previous argument about the single mother, you're just going to walk in and choose the first 6 people and then leave without knowing. A lot of people do that. A lot of people that don't know who the candidates are, that don't know who the issues are, that don't know where the candidates stand on the various issue that's important to them. They walk in and they just check, or they may do every other person. I'll choose every other person. There's a certain algorithm to the way they vote. In some cases, my position on having no party versus having parties, I mean, Democrats have had a stronghold in Alexandria for the last 12 years. We've had mayor, city council members. And I think that a lot of people would like to change that. A lot of people would like for it to stay the same. My thought process is, I'm a Democrat. I was a delegate for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and I hold wholeheartedly to that. And I vote Democrat. I have voted Republican in several elections because I did not like the Democratic person. But in most of the times, 90% of the times, I vote Democrat. And I'm saying that to say that's just because of the history of the Democratic versus Republican Party and the Voting Rights Act of 1963. That's the reason. And then the lineage that my family came from and the heartache. Like you walking into a polling booth saying, tell me, how many ounces of water are in this? If you can't tell me, you can't vote.
On the topic of Jim Crow voting restrictions, Scott, what did you learn in your history research here locally in terms of how Jim Crow was implemented here specifically to prevent specific people from casting a ballot?
Sure, absolutely. And it's important so we had voting via voice, and then it switched to a party ballot system where the political parties would print out a ticket, and you would be given the ticket. It would be brightly colored, so it was still very much a public act. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, under the 15th Amendment, African American men are supposed to be able to vote, but they're still doing it in public, which means that there's opportunities for intimidation. There's opportunities for violence. Now, around the world, in places like England and Australia, there's a movement towards the secret ballot. And in fact, when it's introduced into the United States, it's known as the Australian ballot because it's most associated with Australia. And we can talk a little bit more about the fight over the adoption of the secret ballot in Virginia, because it's a fascinating story. But to answer your question...
Was that the 1870s?
It was actually not till the 1890s,
1890s.
when the secret ballot was adopted in Virginia. Was adopted statewide in Virginia. But what ended up happening with the secret ballot was, on paper, you think, okay, secret ballot, you can't be intimidated anymore. It's going to be more fair. Unfortunately, the white supremacists who were in charge of the Virginia government at the time twisted the ballot in such a way that it furthered their goals of disenfranchising the state's African American population. So the law about the secret ballot, the Walton Act, when it was published, it only gave the person in the ballot box 2.5 minutes to fill out the entire ballot. So if there were a lot of things to vote on, if there was a lot to fill out, or if you were trying to remember which candidate you supported, you only had 2.5 minutes, and you can better believe that the justices, the judges administering the ballot places, they were going to give more time to the white voters than they were to the black voters. In addition, it was also set up that you didn't check next to the person you wanted. You were supposed to cross out the names of everybody you didn't want to vote for. So again, and they specifically said you had to be 3/4 of the way crossed out. You couldn't just X out the person's name. It had to be 3/4 of the way. So again, you're adding more and more restrictions. You're making it more and more difficult to vote. And again, you're taking the secret ballot, which I like the secret ballot. I don't want to go back to voting via voice. I don't want to go back to voting via ballot. But in the hands of this post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction Virginia government that is determined to disenfranchise so many Virginians, they were able to twist it in such a way. Now, this is before the 1902 Constitution of Virginia, which goes even further in disenfranchising black Virginians. Now, the poll tax, of course, is very well known, and we found references to it in the research that for elections that were going to happen in the next year, so say an election in 1926, the poll tax had to be paid by December 7th, 1925. So it wasn't like something you could pay when you got there. You had to pay it ahead of time, or guess what? You weren't voting that year.
Michael Maybaum.
Sometimes problems can contain their own solution. We have political parties, at least in part, because people don't know all the candidates. So they say, well, I'm a Democrat, but I don't recognize all 6 Democrat names, so I'll vote for them, even though I don't know half of the candidates, etc. If we have wards, people will say, I'm a Democrat, but I might vote for the person, even though a Republican, because I've lived next door to them for 6 years, or I've seen them in the neighborhood, or I've met them at the Lyceum or whatever. So part of the problem of having at-large elections is anonymity. It's a big city, and so I asked myself, I've been voting since I legally could vote. I've never missed an election, but no one except in Alexandria said to me, please vote for 6. Otherwise, a governor and senator and congressman and, I don't know, attorney general, et cetera, it's vote for 1. But vote for 6. And I think this is an odd thing to ask for people to do. And if we had wards, we would say vote for 1, and then we would have competition. You know, everyone loves competition. We like the post office versus FedEx versus UPS, Chevy versus Ford versus Acura, and on and on. Airlines, United, American, Delta, thank you very much. Any other airlines you want me to mention? Southwest, et cetera. We love competition, and yet in our city, we don't have competition. And it's not healthy. It's not healthy for the people that control everything. If you don't go to a football game, somebody said to me, Minnesota is playing tonight. I'm trying to remember. David, you did. And if the other team didn't show up, that would be a sort of a boring game, right? Yeah, but you would take that, right? But the point is, competition improves everything. And we want to have competition in our city. And if we had wards, and there's only 25,000, 30,000 people in a ward, people would go door to door and say, I'll do it for 2 years, and I'm going to go door to door and get to know my neighbors. I don't have to raise a lot of money. I don't have to spend a huge amount of time now, but I can do that in my neighborhood. I got elected to office when I was 20 years old as a college student in DeKalb County, Illinois. I was a junior in college, county board member, and I went to every door in my district, and I won by, it's a 6-1 Democratic district. I was a Republican, and I won by 37 votes. 37, they call me landslide Maybach. And I won by 37 votes because I went to every door. And I think people said, you know, I'm not in his party, and he looks like he's 12 years old, and what is he? He's a college student, but he came to our door, and I ran against a campus minister that had a great big beard and didn't campaign much because he was going to win. And so even the voters will even change parties to vote for you if they meet you. And we should have that kind of a city where we can meet the candidates because they can come to our door and not have to talk to 160,000 people while they're raising the kids as a single mother or whatever they're doing in their life professionally. It ought to be something they can do and not make it a full-time job.
All right, go ahead.
No, my thought is on that, as president of the NAACP, we get discrimination complaints a lot. One discrimination complaint I received from a gentleman who lives here in Alexandria, and he lives in a community of people that hate him and threaten him and want him to leave. Now, in a ward system, if I live in a ward where no one really wants me there, but I own this place, and no one can make me move, in that ward system, you're trapped in that ward because you want to stay there because you bought the property, but the people that live in your neighborhood and then surrounding districts, because you're the only minority, want you to leave. And what do you do in those cases? You say, hey, you go to see mayor, you see members of city council, you report to the police department. With the system the way that it is now, you have a roster of people that not only represent that particular district, but the entire city. So you have 6 people he can go to versus 1 person in that ward. And I'm going to leave it right there.
Great. So I want to point out, just looking at the time, it's after 8 o'clock, and we should probably start wrapping things up. But we haven't hit all our bullet points yet, so I want to make sure we get to a couple things, starting with 45 days of early voting. Virginia has the longest period in the country of early voting. So now we've got drop boxes, and we've got mail voting, postal voting. Darrell and Franklin, 45 days strikes a lot of people as too long. What's your thought on that?
I think you should give people their constitutional right to vote with as many days as possible for them to vote in. In 2004, I believe it was, I lived, at the time I was just finished with graduate school and I was living in Maryland. I got up that November morning, went to my local library. I waited in line for 2 hours to vote. 2 hours. That's a long time. I didn't get to work until almost 11 o'clock. And I just could not believe how long and I was angry. And then, I learned in other districts throughout the continental United States, it was worse. There were some people that waited 8 hours to vote. So if you give people a longer enough time, a long runway, I'll go vote on a Saturday. When I'm out with my kids, I can go to the library, or I can wait and vote on election day. And rest assured, the line is not going to be that long. My personal thought, give as many people as long a period of time as they need to cast their ballot to vote.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add to that is there's such a long history in Virginia and in this country of making it harder for people to vote. There's such a long history of, no, you shouldn't be able to vote, whether it's because I don't like your positions, or I just don't like you, or I think I'm better than you. So I'm generally in the camp of, we should be making it easier for people to vote. I left Pennsylvania, where I grew up, to go to college here in Virginia. I voted absentee, and it was a great option to have because I was passionate about the elections happening in my hometown. I think, laying my cards on the table, I think it would be great if this country got to a point where everybody voted. But to do that, we got to understand the barriers that exist, especially for people who are juggling multiple jobs, who have childcare obligations. So I think in general, the conversation should be less about, what are the restrictions, but also how are we facilitating access? How are we making it so that everybody is empowered to know the issues, know the candidates, and know their options for how they cast the ballot?
Michael Maybach.
Yes, well,
Microphone?
I'm sorry.
The people who like 45 days of early voting would say it gives you all of that time to do everything Scott just talked about and Darylyn talked about. You could research. So what's wrong with having 45 days? Why is that a problem?
Well, I guess it could be 90, it sounds like. So the American University, we both have degrees from there, and University of Wisconsin at Madison did studies on early voting, and what they found was that turnout is lower the more you have early voting. The concerns I have about early voting include these, and I'm not against maybe a few days. Maryland has 12 days, the district has 12 days, but 45 days, that is 6.5 weeks. But the concerns I have are, number one, chain of custody. Everyone used to vote on election day, so the chain of custody was everybody that voted today and then the box of absentee, and that was the chain of custody. Now you have in Virginia 6.5 weeks of protecting and defending the custody, the security of those ballots. Number two, early voting pretty much abolishes poll watchers. When I was growing up, my mother and other neighbors would be poll watchers. And on election day, they would sit at the polls on behalf of their party, Republican or Democratic or Libertarian or whatever they were. And they would, as people checked in to vote, and I've been a poll watcher myself, but no political party has 6 weeks of volunteers. So the poll watching that citizens have done historically seems to be gone. The other thing is we start voting at the end of September. So those voters that vote then versus on election day in November have different sets of facts, don't they? They haven't heard the presidential debates yet. They haven't heard the gubernatorial or the city council debates, etc. They haven't found out that one of the candidates has been arrested or indicted, or maybe they died. And all of a sudden they can't change their vote even though that person now is going to jail, for example.
Darylyn, Franklin, do you have any response to that? Because we need to actually move on to different topics.
In lieu of time, I'll pass. But I don't agree with half the stuff he said.
Well, just go for it.
No, I mean, you talk about the chain of custody. If they're in lockboxes, one, and the lockboxes are held at the Department of, or in the Board of Elections, then how are those boxes tampered with? Was it in the year 2000 when you had Mel Carnahan beat John Ashcroft in a gubernatorial election in Missouri and lost because he died and his name stayed on the ballot anyway because his name was already on the ballot. So that's irrelevant. That's just a couple of things. You know, I just don't agree. I think you need to give people their right to be able to vote with as much time and as much lenience as possible.
All right.
Now, period.
Okay, sir. We are kind of running toward the end of our time, so I wanted to make sure we talked about elected school boards because the Alexandria School Board is considering changing the way they do elections, perhaps having staggered terms. And so I wanted to set the stage for the discussion about elected school boards by talking about a historical anecdote that is really interesting. I recently found out that has to do with the history of massive resistance in Alexandria. Arlington, way back in the 40s, I think it was, had an elected school board, and they started steps to integrate Arlington schools. This is before Brown versus Board. And the General Assembly said, hell no, you're not going to do that. And they actually made it illegal to have elected school boards. And it wasn't until many years later. Scott, what is the history of the relationship between massive resistance and elected school boards?
You actually covered that pretty well, Michael. So Alexandria, for many, many years, going back to the 19th century, school board members were appointed. Although interestingly and interesting enough, at that time, the council also met and personally elected every member of the police department in the 1880s. So they were choosing school board members and police officers, all as part of the job before that became a more civil service process. As Michael said, General Assembly allowed Arlington to have elected school boards in 1948. And then in the 1950s, as it seemed that Arlington was taking steps towards integration, the state government stepped in, took away that right, and said that local governments were specifically prohibited from electing school boards. Now, it got to the point by the early 1990s that Virginia was kind of the odd person out. Most of the rest of the country allowed local districts to elect school boards if they wished. And so it ended up coming into an issue. The city council considered it in 1991, although it was raised as early as 1970. City council turned to the issue, and then there was a referendum in 1993. And talk about bipartisan. Democratic Party was in favor, Republican Party was in favor, many civic organizations were in favor. However, there was concern among some civil rights organizations that that moving towards elected boards would mean that there'd be a loss of diversity on the board itself, moving away from an appointed board. Ultimately, however, the vote passed in favor of electing a school board, and then the talk turned to, well, are we doing an at-large system for the school board? Are we doing wards? And ultimately, it came down to kind of three options. There was at-large. There was a ward system where the wards would be equal in population and equal in the number of representatives. And then there was a third option where it was going to be wards with unequal population and unequal representation. So the second option, it was, say, 2,000 people in a ward, you get two representatives. Under the third option, it was Ward A might have 4,000 people and get 4 reps. Ward B might have 2,000 people in it and get 2 reps. And that was seen at the time as maybe being a little more friendly to preserving diversity on the board. Ultimately, though, of course, the second option with equal representation in each ward and equal number of representatives in each ward, that was the one that went with.
So, yeah, the current Alexandria School Board has 9 members. They're all elected at the same time. They represent districts. Michael Maybach, do you have any thoughts on reforming how school board members are elected in Alexandria?
Well, I support the current, which is we have 3 districts we call A, B, and C. We have a total of 9 members. They are all elected together in term, And this way, parents and others interested in our education here can move that boat, that ship, back and forth as they wish. Schools have become very political in America, highly a volatile issue, Loudoun County, for example, and therefore to remove the election of school boards from the people in Alexandria, I think would be resisted mightily. I think what we have now is very good. We have, in effect, 3 wards, and I wish we had that for city council.
So staggered terms, you have any thoughts? So currently, all 9 school board members are all elected in the same election cycle. Should they be staggered?
I think you stagger terms when you have a 3-branch of government. We stagger terms in the U.S. Senate, which is quite a novelty because it's part of the U.S. House, Senate, presidential courts system. But to just stagger within a 9-member, I think, takes away a citizenry's ability to move that ship. If it's just a third of them every couple of years, I think people would be very frustrated with getting change that they want.
Darrell and Franklin, any thoughts on how the school system does it? And they're currently considering their whole system and possibly making some changes. Should they make any changes?
I agree with what Michael has said, and I think that the city council should do the same. I don't think there should be staggered elections with city council either. City council and mayor, I should say. I think they walk in as one administration and sit down and make policy and to help our city and help our school board around the city. So I agree with you.
Finding common ground at Agenda Alexandria. Scott, did you Scott, did you have any thoughts do you want to add on that?
No, I agree with what both of them said.
What a great way to end our panel discussion. We're kind of over time. So any other thoughts from our panelists that you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance, that I didn't prompt you to say anything that you wanted to add, make amendments? Now is your chance. If not, we're going to end. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Go ahead. Yes.
One thing that hasn't been talked about is in the 18th and all the way through the 19th centuries, you voted, you got booze. Maybe we should bring that back. And, you vote, you get some whiskey, you maybe get a beer. I don't know, something to talk about.
One more bit of housekeeping before we end this evening. I want to give a preview for our next Agenda Alexandria. So we won't be meeting in December. There's no December meeting, but there is a January meeting where we're going to talk about broadband and artificial intelligence. The machines are coming for us. And so that'll have all kinds of ramifications in terms of education, privacy, telehealth, and more. So Agenda Alexandria in January. Please put it on your calendars. I'd like to thank our panelists and our audience. Thank you so much, and have a great night.
This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history, Agenda Alexandria is here to shine a light. What makes the organization so successful is our people. The people who run it, our panelists, our moderators, and of course, our members. Agenda Alexandria is a member-funded organization, and we invite you to become one today by visiting agendaalexandria.org.